Few weeks ago my FTP exceeded 4 watts per kilo for the first time in my life, and to this day it still continues to grow. I've never felt better in my own body, stronger on the bike, and I'm no longer dropped whenever the road hits the slightest incline. And it is not by luck. However, to paint a picture, let's go a little bit back in history. Few months ago I made a video about my first ever win on Zwift, and although I definitely considered it an achievement, I was sort of downplaying it as a kind of an outlier. But in the last few months I've done a lot to improve my fitness, mostly silently, without mentioning it too much on the outside, because honestly I was kind of afraid I would need to admit it didn't work. The last winter was a disaster for my fitness. I have been more sick than healthy, my training went completely out of the window, and I gained a ton of weight. From the cycling standpoint, there was only one thing that I didn't lose, and that was my sprint power. And that meant that whenever I got to the finish line with a group, I was a strong contender. But the problem is, that almost never happened. Each time the race hit an incline, I was dropped immediately. I was able to go deep in the suffer zone, but the power didn't reflect that, and my weight dragged down my results even further. I have fully realized it in early May when I returned home from a holiday in Netherlands and did the first few stages of the Spring Giro Sisu Tour. I was going to the limit in each race but struggled to compete even in C category. And I said that's enough. I started a mission. I started obsessively counting calories, increased my cycling volume heavily, restricted alcohol intake, and for the most part started going to sleep before midnight. Which, by the way, was a big improvement for me, even though it doesn't sound like that. And I could feel the results almost immediately. At the end of May I did a ramp test, already 2 kilos down, in which I've recorded my best results to date. In June I continued with this routine, training diligently, and completed my first ever outdoor race. And in July I went toe-to-toe with the best Zwift racers in the Sisu Tour, where I finished on the 9th place in the Sprint Championship. And here came the start of August. For the first time in about 15 years my weight got below 72 kilos, 8 kilos lower than what it was 3 months ago, and finally it was in the normal BMI range. What didn't go down, however, was my training and power output. At this point I was averaging over 12 hours of training each week, and I didn't feel I lost a single watt. And when I saw that all 4 August Z racing routes are just plain awesome, I decided to test myself. So let's take a look at how it went. And the first race of the series was on an Innsbrucking route. 2 laps, 2 ascents of the leg snapper. Having just returned from beatdown upon beatdown from the best Zwift riders, I had no clue about what to expect. I was nervous because getting beaten by riders that have 300 more racing score was expected, but now it was time to see if what I am doing was really working. But right from the start I knew this wasn't going to be a difficult race. In fact, at that point I knew I entered way too low category. On the first leg snapper I basically rode away from the entire group without too much of a hassle. I got then caught on the downhill part, but it really didn't matter. I didn't need to push. I knew I would be able to get to the sprint finish, and that was my game. So on the second leg snapper I didn't even try to ride away, I simply hooked myself behind the front guys, and I was content with that. Which in retrospect I sort of regret. I think I should have tried to go for a breakaway win here, but at the time I didn't want to risk what I perceived as an easy podium spot. So we continued as a group, as expected, basically until the 400 meter mark. And I got actually surprised here a little bit. This group had superb sprinters. I did basically the best sprint of my life here, reaching over 17.5 watts per kilo momentarily, but it still wasn't enough for the win. But I was very happy with that result. The second race would be 6 laps on the Glasgow crit course, and this time I went a category up to 510 to 650 bracket. The only objective here was not to get dropped on the Clyde kicker, but still I didn't have super high expectations for this race. But once again, it did not feel particularly difficult, at least not in the first 5 laps. I was comfortably in the group. On each glide kicker I punched the power hard to make sure I am not at the back over the crest of the hill, and then recovered for the remainder of the lap. On the last lap then, the things got a little trickier, and honestly to this point I don't know if I could have played it better. There were two guys going into a breakaway, but one of them dropped really quickly and I didn't believe the other one would make it on their own. But the further we have gone into the lap, the more it looked like they might. It also looked like that the group was pretty content with conceding the first place as no one was chasing. I cannot blame them as I wasn't chasing either, but I didn't want to be the one who would bring the breakaway back only to be outsprinted at the finish line. Few hundred meters before the finish line there were another guys who took off, and here I very likely made a mistake. Once again, I didn't want to become a lead-out train for all the sprinters in the race, but it also meant that we gave away just another podium spot. It was only at the last incline where I fully committed, firstly with an increased effort and then an all-out sprint. I finished third in this race, and that was something I definitely didn't expect in this bracket. Week 3 brought us to the first route with a proper climb, Sand and Sequoias. It is basically flat desert riding with a Titan's Grove crossing tucked in the middle. The first part of the race wasn't something I was really concerned about. At one point two guys launched a breakaway attempt, but this far off the finish line I wasn't really concerned about it being any kind of threat. But then few other guys started chasing, and that already had a breakaway potential, so I went as well. We didn't get into a breakaway, but ultimately I didn't even want to. I was just glad at that point that the group was back together. When we reached the Titans KOM, I hit the lap button because I had a number in my mind that I didn't really want to go over on this climb. But since it was pretty shallow and draftable, I didn't even need to. Near the top, one of the guys launched a pretty heavy attack, but I felt good and I still had my featherweight power up, so I decided to chase it, and we crossed the line together, about 5 seconds in front of the rest of the group. On the descent then, I tried to push to stay in the breakaway and the other guy was working with me, but ultimately the downhill momentum of the group behind us caught us up, and it was clear it would go down into just another sprint finish. And this time I didn't repeat my mistake from the Glasgow. I covered an early attack and went for a sprint at the perfect time. And that means I had another race win in my pocket, and this time it was on a course I was pretty unsure about. Now, before we go to the 4th week, we need to quickly cover what has happened in the meantime. I have done another race between stages 3 and 4. You might have already seen the video about that one, but long story short, it was a long climbing race on which I've put my best ever watts for 20 minutes, and after it concluded, I got at last promoted to A category. And the reason why am I mentioning it here is it impacted how I've done the 4th August race. I wanted a proper test, so I entered arguably the hardest pen I was allowed in, Tuesday evening 570 to 725 bracket, and boy were they big names in this race. What's more, this isn't an easy route, 2 laps of rolling highlands after fairly long lead-in. The start was, at least by Zwift standards, incredibly mellow, and I had no doubts we would pay for that later. And I was right in that regard. On the cliff climb of the first lap, Tepolorio launched a heavy attack and it looked like he might get gone very quickly. I don't want to concede that right there, but I had to go pretty near my limit to chase them. It was worth it though. No attack lasts forever and the group got back together. And after that, nothing of a significance happened until basically the corkscrew climb to the castle in the final lap. I knew things would get insane on that short incline, so I basically hammered it glide kicker style. But so did everyone else, and what's more, on top of it, it looked like Douglas Cameron launched a long-range attack, and that didn't feel like something I could chase. Thankfully, as he later admitted, that was just a bluff, and that meant I was able to arrive at the bottom of Breakaway Bray with the front. But once again, I reacted way too late for the attack that arrived, and when I did, the first 3 guys that went were pretty damn ahead. What's more, I didn't have any juice left to do my usual finish. This was a very hard race. I went sprinting out of the saddle for a few seconds, but couldn't keep at it, and I arrived on the finish on 7th spot. Still, 7th spot in the highest bracket besides advanced is something I wouldn't dream of a few months ago. In the end, I think I can safely conclude this series was a big success for me. If you like this and would like to see the story of a race that finally pushed me into A category, click here.